to complement each other. So we need to do that. And once you truly come to understand where your God is, if you love the Lord, you will find fulfillment in that.
Welcome to the Rich Dawn, where eternal beatitude begins in this life. I'm Kyle Dean, and today I have with me Liz Anna, a young adult Catholic here in the Western New York region, a member of the Dynamis Ministry, and a loving wife and mother of 3 beautiful and sweet children. Liz, how are you today?
Good, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for coming on. So in today's episode, we're going to get into the unwinnable, most controversial, ridiculous debate that no one even cares about unless you're in a really, really niche circle of Catholicism, and that is the ubiquitous pants debate. How do you feel?
There certainly is no winning here.
So let's just do it then. You know, like we'll either blow up the channel or get it canceled before it ever gets off the ground. And I'm completely content either way. So no, all joking aside though, what we're going to talk about today is modesty. You know, like the virtue of modesty, of course, it falls under temperance. And, you know, what that might look like in the life of a person of faith. You know, and I think it transcends Catholicism. You see modesty in many great faith traditions. You know, the Abrahamic ones and beyond. But then, of course, you have, in this modern era of secularism, a lot of people that follow different trends, you know, worship whatever, different things, sometimes ourselves in the fashion industry, or whatever else it is that we focus on. And we may or may not even give a thought to modesty, right? So, but before we get into that, let's learn a little bit about you, Liz, the woman. I know we connected recently. You're good friends with my wife, of course, and y'all have talked about this before, like your love and desire to kind of live, you know, the traditional faith lifestyle, right? Like, you know, like loving your husband, he's the head. You know, certain dress code, and I guess maybe you could explain a little bit, like, you know, where are you on that journey? You know, where were you yesterday? Where are you today? And why it has an impact on you?
Well, I think this has been a really long journey for me.
Yeah.
I was brought up Catholic, and I fell away after high school when I was in college and was pretty much nothing. After some experiences, I had someone close to me go through a really difficult time, and I basically reached out to God, like, if you exist, then you need to let me know. And right after that prayer, God connected this person with the absolute perfect person to help them.
Wow.
And I couldn't deny God's existence after that moment. And so I started going to a non-denominational church after that, because that's where there were people that I knew that they seemed very joyful, and
That's important.
It was very, what's the word I'm looking for? It was very appealing, the joyfulness. And so I went there for a few years, and then ended up at a mass where, when the host was raised, totally by the grace of God, could not deny that was his presence. Wow. And after that moment, I could not go anywhere other than the Catholic faith. Really?
So it came full circle. You were raised in it, but when you were a nun, an None, throughout your college years, you know, it's quite a common trend, right? Like you're going to plug back into a faith expression if you have that conversion moment with who you know or whatever community is available to you. But then you basically came full circle. You're like, you know, that is Jesus in the Eucharist, and then ended up back into the faith that you were raised in. Yeah. So full circle, huh? Yeah. What just for the sake of timeline, about how long ago was that? Like, how long have you been practicing as an adult?
Just a little over 10 years.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So you know your faith, obviously. Mm-hmm. And isn't it incredible when, you know, you come to that relationship with Jesus to where you're not doing it because it's how you were raised, but you're doing it because you realize that it's right?
Yeah. And honestly, I truly think it was a grace that God allowed me to leave the faith, because I think I could have been a very legalistic Catholic had he not allowed that. And because of that time away from the faith and the sins that I committed during that time, I think it allowed me to have compassion for those who may be committing those same sins that I have committed. And I think I could have been one of those people that was like, you're committing this sin, and very harsh. And because of that time where I was separated from God, he allowed me to see that he will continue to love us no matter what.
His mercy. Yeah. Maybe a little more mercy, a little less justice sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, praise God. And I can definitely relate to that. I had a similar trajectory growing up. I was always spiritual, but I wasn't religious for a time. I guess you could say I fell into like almost new age trappings, although I didn't recognize it or identify it as that at the time, until I really took seriously like the principle of non-contradiction. Like, I learned about all these different religions, and some of them say radically different things about what happened in the life of Jesus, right? Is he a prophet? Is he a bad man? Did he exist at all? And everyone's got a different answer for that. And if you believe he's truly the Lord, then, of course, you're drawn into Christianity, and Catholicism is, we believe the original expression of Christianity, and it's the church that Jesus himself founded. So it's very important. It's important to know those things. And so similarly to you, I was raised Catholic, but I didn't become a practicing Catholic until I understood the why. And it certainly wasn't, because that's what your parents did, wow, that's beautiful. And so regarding, I'll just come right out with it to connect it to, what we came to talk about today. I know, both you and my wife, one of the things that you have in common is that you love modesty in the form of, like wearing skirts and dresses, and, you pick certain style choices in order to be in conformity with your understanding of, authentic Catholicism and biblical realities, things that are in the Bible. And also it ties into your relationship with your husband. So it sounds like you said you've had a real journey along the way. I would imagine you've probably had a journey that connects to that as well. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, I think in my journey of coming back to Catholicism, I've learned about the beauty of differences between men and women. I can honestly say I was one of those people that said a woman can do everything a man can do. I used to be a volunteer firefighter, and I would say I could do everything a man can do. And then I took 2
You were a volunteer firefighter?
I was.
That's beast mode. Yes. Thank you for your service.
Thanks.
Oh, that's great.
Well, so during that time, I took a 2-week boot camp class to become an interior firefighter. And during that time, it became very apparent to me that I could not do everything a man can do. And I think that was the first moment where I said, okay, as a woman, I am very different from a man. And that was hard to accept. But I think it was a great grace to see that in real time.
Sure.
And I think as time has gone on, it has allowed me to accept that as a woman, there are different things we're meant to do. God has given us the grace to bear children, and we're the kinder person, not always, but in the home we tend to be the kinder person with our children, and so our clothes need to reflect that. Our clothes are very much change how we interact with people. And I've noticed the more I wear skirts and dresses, the more feminine my personality seems to become.
Wow. That makes a lot of sense. When I met my wife, one thing that was striking for me, I was really drawn to the traditional Latin Mass. That had a lot to do with me connecting into the faith as an adult when I had my big conversion in my mid-20s. And veiling was always such a profound part of the faith expression. And obviously, women generally tend to veil in fulfillment of, the First Corinthians, and men do not, right? Like, we believe that we veil what is sacred, and women veil their head as an extra form of covering, which is something that men do not do. So there's a distinction there that's very visible, very noticeable, and it definitely impacts how people interact with each other. So it's kind of to your point, like what we wear very much impacts how we carry ourselves.
Well, I think in general we've stopped acknowledging the sacred. We've lost that women have this sacred place in society. Veiling reminds us that we're sacred, and we're given that special honor to carry children and to work with God along with our husband to bring life into the world. And so many women have forgotten that, and in our faith tradition we veil all things that are sacred. So it makes sense that women traditionally did veil, and as we've lost the distinction between men and women, we've lost all these beautiful traditions like veiling, and women wearing skirts.
You see that in the religious life as well. You hear about the sisters and nuns, used to veil, and a lot of times in a lot of the orders nowadays, that's been done away with in the last 50 or so years. So I think there's definitely seems to be a connection between the timeline of when things have happened throughout human society and how that's impacted the way that we carry ourselves. So case in point, I'll back up and just say, I was introduced to this subject as a man in a pretty jarring way. So I, as I mentioned, I have a deep love for the traditional Latin Mass, and that's usually where you'll find me. So as I was learning a lot more about my faith as an adult and really learning, about these different traditions that have been passed on throughout church history, obviously when you're involved in a culture that, focuses on that and has that intentionality, you're going to pick up on a lot of different things than another culture where these things just don't get brought up, right? So this idea of even questioning about the efficacy of pants for women is something that I never thought I would even give any time of day until it was presented on the pulpit one day. There was a visiting priest from out of state who proposed to everybody that pants on women is a very new phenomenon that never really existed throughout human history, and made the connection between when that started changing was also when so many other things started changing in the life of the church, and as the church goes, so goes the world, and the world became much more secular, and then took it to another level and basically said, jumped to the conclusion that so women wearing pants is wrong, and kind of like a blanket statement, and we should all go to this bonfire. I want to invite you to a bonfire where the women can burn their pants, and parents have a duty to protect their children, particularly their girls, from wearing this kind of clothing. And as someone, I've been involved in that community for years, but even as somebody that's been involved in the community for years, when you go from 0 to 100 like that, you could imagine, it's like time and place, and pastoral care is an important art, very much so, especially if you're preaching from the pulpit. And so the outcome of that homily was you had a visiting, I don't know if they were visiting family or newer parishioners, but you had like a father with young girls that were in pants who got up and left. I mean, it seemed by the body language like they were perturbed and kind of scandalized and upset. And to this day, I think back on that moment and I reflect about how strange it was to witness that, because unfortunately, you do get, you mentioned how you're grateful that you went through that one journey just so that you could at least have compassion on people that maybe don't see things the way you do now. Sometimes you get people that maybe they just grew up in the traditions and they don't understand that, because they kind of, it's almost like they get a delight out of seeing, yeah, there's the other, they don't do what we do, we got to do it the right way. So you had a little bit of like a patting on the back when something like that happened. Wow, we got real orthodoxy being preached here. And obviously there's not really charity in that. We're supposed to be building bridges with people.
Well, and really there's no specific rule in the church that says you cannot wear pants. And
Right.
While I feel more feminine wearing a skirt, and I would encourage most women to try wearing a skirt, because it does change the way you hold yourself and the way you walk and the way you present yourself. But the church never comes out and says you can never wear pants. And I think there are times and places where pants are appropriate.
Yeah, like wearing a bike maybe, or riding a bike rather.
Riding a bike.
It's probably a good idea.
My daughter climbing on the monkey bars at the playground.
Sure.
Should she wear a skirt down to her feet? Probably not. It would be dangerous.
Sure. You could do leggings,
Right.
pairing.
I usually have her in leggings and a short skirt if we're going to the playground. And I think that's totally appropriate. Working in the ER,
Oh, yes, you're a nurse. I didn't mention that
Yeah.
in the introduction.
So I worked in the ER for a number of years, and I always wore pants there. It was much more appropriate. There were times where, there were people climbing on gurneys to do CPR. I mean, that would certainly not be appropriate in a skirt.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, no doubt.
So there is a time and a place for a skirt, and there are a time and a place where pants are more appropriate.
Right. Well, and yeah, so we concluded that experience that day, which was the first seed ever planted for me to even start trying to chew on this idea, right? And so I'm very research focused, and the priest ordered a challenge to everybody. He said, "Listen, I don't expect to have time in one homily to introduce all of this to you." So to his credit, he said, check out this book, Dressing with Dignity, by Colleen Hammond. It's published by TAN, and copies of it were made available at the church, and he challenged anybody who wanted to learn more to read it. So I did. And my wife and here I am, a Catholic guy, reading about the history of pants in human culture, and I actually thought it was super, super interesting. My wife and I had a lot to reflect on. She was actually pretty excited because she's really big into fashion. And, she's always told me, style and fashion are two different things. She likes style, actually. Let me represent her properly. The fashion industry has a lot of, moving trends, and there can be, a throwaway culture there where, it's not ecologically sound, but style never goes out of style. There's a way to carry yourself. And for her to have her husband on board with all of this, it was it was fun and whatever. But what struck me the most was that the priest had a good point, that there's, up until the mid 20th century, the mid 1900s, there wasn't really, pants on women really wasn't a thing throughout human history.
Yeah, skirts were traditionally what women wore, and pants, I don't remember, did they start? So pants really started around World War II, when women started working in factories, and they were wearing pants probably for much like we talked about, there's an appropriate time and a place for things, and women were in the factories for, since all the men were away at war, and it was a necessity for them to be in
The workforce.
the factory. Yeah. But then at home, traditionally, they were still wearing skirts. So, women didn't change out of skirts for enjoyment. They changed out of skirts out of necessity. And here we are, years later, I wonder what they would think, that we're all just walking around in pants. It's really unfortunate.
It's odd. You know, one of the things I looked into the history of pants for men, right? And it goes back to about like the 6th century BC. Oh, this is the ministry cat here. She loves to come in and bomb some of the audio on these episodes. We'll leave her in there. If anybody hears some meowing, you know, from the episode with Francis Beck. You know, people pointing things out like pants on women has never even existed until the 20th century. Put yourself in the shoes of our ancestors. Some of it was necessity. There was a time when, like, for example, you've got Colleen Hammond's book there, Dressing with Dignity. It's a purple book. It's probably out of camera shot, but they get into this subject. Say goodbye. She's a great cat. But, oh yeah. I can move her. So I looked into the history of pants writ large with men, and that I thought was very telling because, you know, some historians say it goes back to the 6th century BC, and that I think is so telling. I think that's maybe what Colleen Hammond was trying to bring out in this book. It's like, you know, it's not that pants are new or novel. Like, pants have been around for much of human history. But for some reason, from the 1900s to present, women started doing it too. It's just that fascinated me to learn that. Because I think when, you know, a lot of times we kind of get into our own bubble of like, you know, what's going on in my generation is how existence always was. Like, no, like, it's almost all of our ancestors, like, it would have been foreign to them.
But I think, too, it would have been foreign to them. You know, we have this ambiguity between male and female. And those concepts would have been so foreign to them because women can only do certain things and men can only do certain things. And we're trying to pretend like that doesn't exist. And
I'm glad you pointed that out, too, because you're like, listen, women can't do certain things men can do. And I should have jumped in and been like, yeah, and there's a lot of things that men cannot do that only women can do. And not just childbirth, but of course that's top of list, right? Like, and of course we want to celebrate our complementarity.
Right.
Right? There's no competition there properly expressed, you know, like obviously, you know, the catechism and the canons that talk about matrimony point out post-fall men and women have had tensions. And that's an effect of the fall. But the goal in life is to achieve that complementarity. And that's by embracing our differences.
Colleen brings this up in the book, too, that one of the effects of the fall is that women want to take over men's jobs and to be in charge of things. And really, that's not women's place. And I think in dressing with pants, again, there's a time and a place, but for the most part, the man should be the leader and the man should be in charge. And you know, there's a beauty to not having to be in charge. And I think our society fails to see that beauty. It's so wonderful to be taken care of by my husband and to have him be in charge of our household and to not have the stress of having to make those decisions that he has to make. I don't envy his position. It's an incredibly difficult position to be in. And it's so beautiful when you are in a relationship where the husband truly is the leader and the wife is submissive and you are cared for. And, you know, and I think our clothes reflect that. You know, as a woman, I'm wearing a skirt. I'm not going to be able to jump, climb. It's not going to be as easy for me to be out in the workforce working in a factory, but that would be where my husband needs to be. And at home when I'm sweeping or I'm washing the dishes or whatever, you know, a skirt isn't going to get in the way of that.
Right. And I think one of the great takeaways that can translate to anybody listening in too, whether you're practicing Christian or not, is just allowing for those of us who want to live like this. It shouldn't have to be controversial to just talk about it, right? Like, for example, I mentioned like just as a guy taking on this subject, whatever, and getting involved with my wife, but it actually goes deeper than that. Like I'm a commissioned leader of young adult ministry, and so I work with men and women all the time, trying to meet them where they're at, but not keep them where they're at in terms of their levels of virtue, so that they can become saints. And so I've talked to a lot of women about this topic as well. Like my research isn't just scholarly or theological, it's experiential. And I've had women more than once say, to even be introduced to this idea of modesty as, taking a look at the kind of clothing choices that we make, there are a lot of women who say it means everything for me to hear a man say it to me. It would mean nothing for me to hear it from one of my fellow women. Which I think that fascinated me the first time I ever encountered that. I'll never forget it, because obviously as a guy, it almost feels like, why would I want to tackle a subject where there's no trophies at the end of this conversation? You know what I mean? And it's certainly, especially for a man who's not a clergy, to have a conversation with somebody else, like that's not my wife. It's like, it's just, there's a lot of sensitivity there and a lot of do's and don'ts. And but it surprised me to hear, because it shatters that narrative, the secular narrative that's like, men shouldn't tell women what to do, or men shouldn't even be a part of the conversation about what women want to decide to do with their lives. And that's obviously impossible to square up with that idea of complementarity and like marriage and men and women coming together and being on the same page about things. You know what I mean? So I found that to be interesting, that certain women wouldn't even be influenced by another woman about thinking about modesty in new ways.
Well, I think as a woman, it's really good to hear a male's perspective on this topic, because we're bombarded in society about how men want to see us dressed scantily and they won't give us the time of the day otherwise. And in
those
reality,
aren't men, those are boys at best.
Well, but unfortunately their voice, that's the voice you're hearing. You're not hearing. And I think part of it is what you're talking about. Like, men don't realize that women need to hear from those men. So we need heroic men in our churches and our society to speak out and say, look, this is not what we want to see. We want to see women dressed appropriately. We want to see you beautifully covered. And that is way more beautiful to us than you exposing yourself in inappropriate ways.
Right.
And
it's like exploitation.
Yeah. And, women don't, we're so often told in society that our job is only to take care of ourselves. Whereas in Catholicism, our job is to take care of others. We're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. It's our job to stay away from the occasion of sin. But as women, we can present ourselves an occasion of sin for men if we are not dressed appropriately. And in loving our neighbor, it is our job, it is our duty as good Catholics to make sure that we are not presenting an occasion of sin for others. And so often people say, well, the men should just keep their their eyes looking at inappropriate things. That's their own problem. But we should not be the ones presenting them with that occasion of sin.
Right. And when the final judgment, women who knowingly did that are going to be held responsible for that. Right. There's no being off the hook on that. It's sad. It's sad when you see those, like, because that's another modernist, feminist, secular cultural thing, right? Where you have these like activist photos with a woman scantily clad wearing like "don't touch this" or "my body, my choice" or no means no. It's like when you start bringing in like really heated subjects about sexual abuse and whatever, like going against somebody's consent, but also flaunting yourself in a certain way. They obviously do it to make a point, and it's shocking. It's a great It's like the visual grabbing version of a soundbite or whatever, but it's so twisted. It's like it totally misses the point. And I think like what we need to pivot to, especially just as a husband and as a father who wants to see better for my children, we need to get back to men being men and women being women, like you said, right? Like, and men by being the leaders. It's not, all authority in life is loaned, right? It's using it but not abusing it, and recognizing that for anybody that has authority, you're going to be held to the fire big time. You're going to be held to account for how you utilize that. So it's not oppression, like oppressing women or holding women down because you have the authority is like it's not even the same ball field of what we're talking about here in terms of that authentic expression.
It's funny that people like to say that women are oppressed when the most revered person in the Catholic Church is the Mother Mary. And, this was thousands of years ago. She became the most revered person in the Catholic Church. All generations
shall call me blessed.
And some people want to say that the Catholic Church oppresses women. It's so far from the truth. I mean, we're so incredibly free. Like I said, it's such a blessing to have my husband over me. It's so freeing that he makes such difficult decisions that I don't have to deal with that. And, there will always be situations that are outliers, that are unfortunate, where, people are in difficult situations. But in good, healthy marriages, the husband should be in charge and should be taking care of his wife.
Right. And that's what the church teaches too, right? Like, I appeal for anybody that's just like, it sounds like nails on a chalkboard for them. It's like, listen, okay, you do you then. If what works for you, I don't know that it will, because whenever you step outside the natural law, it never ends up panning out in the long run. But for those of us who want to create a space or to reclaim enough ground in the culture to at least be able to do what we do, like, religious freedom, as they say here in America, this is something that needs to be talked about. We should be hearing about it from the pulpit in due proportion to what the church actually teaches. And that's one reason why I'm grateful to have this conversation with you now, right? Like, you've been involved in ministry. You were at the first ever Dynamis Mass. I just realized that recently, actually. Just going back, reviewing the old photos, like, Liz was there, and which is amazing. And, of course, you've been involved with the co-ed nights, and we've got men's nights and women's nights and everything now. And so we have to be able to have the conversation. For those of us who want to plug in or who want to learn more or try to figure out like what does and doesn't actually make sense in light of what Colleen Hammond presented, in light of that priest that I wasn't expecting to hear that from the pulpit. And then I had to be very intentional about figuring out what does the church really teach here. So I'm thankful that we can just, hash this out responsibly as adults. So I want to pivot back. You've mentioned your great love for your husband, and like he's got your back, and like there is that authority structure. As Catholics, we believe that the man is the head. St. Thomas Aquinas, who's one of the greatest authorities in the church, in his writings mentions how, like if the husband and wife can't come to an agreement on something, one wants to go one way, one wants to go the other, it's the husband where the buck stops. A lot of modernists don't want to hear that, or would take issue with that. But again, of course, you're talking about people with at least average virtue, where the husband is, if we're talking about proper use of authority, right? Where it's neutral or morally excellent, never anything that's morally wrong. And with your husband, I mean, you asked him to be on here. He was like, yeah, go for it. You know what I mean? Like, and a lot of that came from, your connection with, some people know about the Gordon family. They have a Catholic apostolate out there, and they wrote a book called Ask Your Husband, which is squarely based on a scripture, a line, an epistle from St. Paul mentioning about, women submitting to their men. And it's like, how did that become controversial if that's what's in the Bible?
Right. And it's wild because I went to Catholic school all my life. I had never heard this until about 2 years ago.
Oh,
and
wow. And you've been practicing as an adult for 10 years.
I had no idea this was a thing. And it was extremely difficult in the beginning to accept that my husband should be in charge of our household. Not that he shouldn't be in charge of our household, but that, ultimately he has the say, and ultimately, I should be coming to him to let him know what's going on.
Right.
And in letting go of that, letting go of wanting to be in charge and wanting to be right in all situations, it has been so beautiful for our marriage. Our marriage has never been so peaceful and so loving. And it really is amazing, like when you follow what God has shown us through Scripture should be the hierarchy of your marriage, how different things can be. But I don't say that it was easy in any way. It was extremely, extremely difficult to get to this point.
Why is that? Like, what was your faith trajectory like? I mean, were you always wearing skirts and dresses as a practicing Catholic, or?
No. So when I came back to the faith, I did come back like very strongly, and I started to wear like super modest, like I was wearing turtlenecks, a little bit crazy. Like really long skirts. And then I pulled back a little bit, and I was like, okay, this is a little bit much.
Sure.
And then I started to wear pants again, and, was a little more in the culture, kind of.
Right.
And then as time went on, it became very obvious that when I was wearing pants, I was holding myself and acting very differently than with skirts. Or, sorry, did I just say when I'm wearing pants?
Yeah.
What I meant was with skirts. When I wear skirts,
Or dresses,
I am holding myself and acting very differently in a much more feminine way.
Right.
And so eventually over time, it's really been like a very long journey to get to the kind of clothes that I'm wearing now. Not only because of like my understanding of church teaching and like my want to please God has increased as time has gone on, but also financially it just didn't make sense to go from wearing all pants to wearing all skirts. And so as time has gone on, my wardrobe has slowly shifted to a more feminine wardrobe, feminine, more modest wardrobe. And, now I am very comfortable in the clothes that I wear. And, before, you would wear pants and you'd always be worried, like, can I lean over? Like, what if someone sees, what if my shirt's too low if I lean over? I don't have to worry about that anymore. Like, there's so many
it's
things.
freeing.
It's very freeing. I don't have to worry about all these things that I used to worry about. And, why would you not want that?
Fair point. I mean, I can't relate personally, but what I can say with my wife too, something that you just brought to my mind is, you mentioned financially it wasn't feasible to go from one to the other right away. And I think that's something that we need to be really sensitive to as well. Like, when people learn about these ideas, and if you can present it in a way that people can actually, like, you can allow for the seed to take root in fertile soil, it is a process. And my wife, she's shared with me that, by the time I met her, by the way, she was already on the modesty grind. And so it wasn't, anything that that we convinced each other based off of picking up a book or anything like that. But she shared with me how throughout her journey, like, in order to actually find like modest clothing, because there's, you could even there's plenty of dresses and skirt options that themselves are very immodest, right? And the book mentions, just to give a concrete guideline here as we pivot in this conversation, it mentions how Pius XI came out with a document in 1929 that kind of defines modesty for women, right? He mentions that the top portion shouldn't go beyond 2 fingers thickness below the pit of your throat, that shoulders should be covered. I think back then it even said like 3/4 length on the arms, and then that the skirt or dress goes below the knee, right? That the knee is covered, right? That's an objective standard that has been documented throughout church history, right? Like 1929, somewhat recent snapshot that we can reference. When my wife strived towards that, it was a very intentional journey for her. Like whether it's thrifting or whatever, or if you go to the different styles that are out there, you really have to look. Mm-hmm. And that, obviously says something about the state of the culture, the secular culture today. And so not only can there be a financial barrier, but there can also be unless you're really convicted on this, people aren't they might give up. They might be like, is it really worth all this effort? God probably doesn't really care that much. Or why would this be so hard if it's what everyone is supposed to be doing? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So you really need to be convicted on your whys before, embarking on this journey. And then also just to have the pragmatic, expectation like we're laying out now that, it takes intentionality.
It does. And I think too, and I myself went through this, the thought that if I'm better than the majority of the people around me, then I'm okay. But that's not what God wants. God wants excellence. He wants excellence in every part of your life. And,
and you don't mean better like you're better than people, but better like
right,
I'm adhering to what he said.
Right. You should be striving to be the best human being for God's sake, for your love of God. And in doing that, it's no longer okay to dress as everyone else dressed or, do what everyone else is doing. And, that's going to look different for everyone, but really, if this touches you at all, you need to spend time in prayer and decide what is it that God is asking of you. I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, there's a reason. And, I'm not saying that you need to tomorrow go out and get rid of all your pants and burn them in the pants burning party like the priest suggested.
Yeah, that was intense.
But I do think that there needs to be some kind of internal reflection about what you're wearing and the appropriateness in all situations.
As long as you mentioned what you just did about how it kind of got taken to a whole nother level in that homily, I spent years researching this because I was really, really impacted by that event. I don't like to see people not be made to feel welcome in God's house. And if somebody says something that strongly, then it better be true. You know what I mean? And unfortunately, I've worked with top theologians on this and have found out that, what he expressed was very zealous, but it was not grounded in the tradition. And objectively speaking, it's actually caused quite a significant amount of damage in our community because, I found this out years later, actually, and I had nothing to do with this personally. For any conspiracy theorists that might be, hanging on to the podcast, hello, nice to have you. But I found out later on, years later, that, the chancery got wind of that and that they were very angered by it to the point where there's talks that are going on right now that we might have the traditional Latin Mass taken away from us because of incidents like that, with priests coming in and saying these foreign things that aren't grounded in the authentic tradition. And if that ends up happening, I'm going to be very upset. So it's so important for us to set the record straight for love of souls, for love of Holy Mother Church, and to defend and preserve her integrity and honor. So let's actually dive into what's in this book. So basically what I'd love to do is, I think that Colleen Hammond, by the way, does a fantastic job. It's interesting. My wife has kind of kept up with her. She has like a social media following, and there's a lot of this book has really caused a movement, and obviously Tan published it for a reason. I have a lot of respect for Tan. In fact, I don't know if it's in the shop, but I've got like a whole Tan wall there. They put out great work, but if someone were to read this work and they don't have the theological training like some of us have, you might be, I don't necessarily think you'd be left with more questions than answers, because the book has a lot of great references to popes, papal quotes, saint quotes, and all the kinds of things you'd love to find in a Catholic book. But it doesn't bring that scholarly, like, systematic tying together of like, okay, these are your concrete calls to action. Like, should we be burning all of our paints in a bonfire? Like, like which of these papal quotes have authoritative weight on what level, right? Like, a lot of times saints, obviously saint quotes even, they can be pious disciplinary meditations, but not binding, doctrinally. So you have to be able to understand and navigate all of that. And also, there's contextualizing it and making it pragmatic for today. Right? It's like, you're not going to, for the radical traditionalists, you're not going to put the genie back in the bottle tomorrow that all women are going to come home from working. And it's like, no, like, you're a nurse, right? Like, if you're in the workforce and they make you wear scrubs, right? Like, okay, so how can we make this pragmatic for now? You know what I mean? So let's get into it. I mean, I'll just rattle off, some quotes to start. Colleen Hammond does a good job of collecting these. You've got Benedict XV. We know that certain modes of dress which women are beginning to accept are harmful to society, for they are a cause of evil. Right? That was the early 1900s. You mentioned World War II.
Well, and isn't it so telling that in the early 1900s, there were popes speaking out about the fashion, and then you look at where it is now, it is infinitely worse. And so why would you want to conform yourself to something that was spoken out against when it wasn't even nearly as bad as it is now? And the Vatican has never put out any specific guidelines. Like you said, the 2 fingers, breath below the pit of the throat, and the long sleeves and the long skirt, that was actually specific rules set for a group of nuns. And so there are no true rules for how women should dress. So
that have been like concretely defined,
right,
and universally binding.
Right. And so, again, these are all things that you need to take to prayer, and you need to speak to God and decide based on that conversation. So this isn't something I can tell you to do. This isn't something Kyle can tell you to do. This is something that you would have to decide with God what the next step is in your modesty journey, which may be a very long journey like mine was.
Right. Well, and far be it from me to share what Kyle thinks. I tend to avoid opinion for the most part, especially, when I'm, if anybody's interested to check out when I do more like theologically defining conversations, I have an apostolate with Dennis G called East to West Theology that you can find. And, there we bring our theologizing, right? Like there's a lot of, we're given like, rules of rules of engagement when we're trained at the master's level, right? Like theological disputation is literally an art that is required for good theologizing. You have to be able to get into the debating and figure out what's the truth. But what you don't do is you don't certainly lead with your opinion, and you don't just lean on opinion. St. Thomas Aquinas actually defines opinion as a deficiency in a certain sense. He's like, it's what somebody, drags out when they don't have objective truth backing them up. So it's not what I'm saying. The church has given a universal norm, just not about skirts and dresses and pants specifically. The universal norm is that we are not to wear clothes that reveal our form. Like that reveal, that of course means like, really tight clothing. Where if you can literally see like everything about like what the naked human body would look like with your clothing, obviously that means no yoga pants. Like, and by the way, even in a yoga studio, but whether they're yoga pants, whether they're whatever, just super tight pants, or even like a super tight, I don't know, dress, I guess, that is objectively frowned upon by Holy Mother Church. And there's a reason for that. It's because more souls, this has been consistent throughout all the centuries of the church. The saints have said, and the church has said, more importantly, magisterially, that more souls fall into hell because of matters of the 6th and 9th commandment than any other sin. And it's because even just like looking at something, like purposefully, or okay, it pops up in front of you, but then you don't go away, like that's enough to be in mortal sin territory. Objectively speaking, it's objective grave matter. So this is serious stuff. And back to your point earlier, like the way that the way the women present themselves, that's why it's important to have good fathers and mothers that are on the same page with this, and to raise your kids right. Because you could be, you're affecting not only your own soul but others, right?
Right.
So that's the objective universal norm that the church has put out there. But when it comes to saying this is how long your dress or your skirt should be, that specific quote that you mentioned was for a specific time period, and it was binding on a specific group of people. Mm-hmm. That wasn't announced for the universal church. So I'm glad you touched on that, because that was one thing I wanted to point out in this book, that if you don't have that refinement, you might not know that reading it.
Yeah, Colleen does seem to lead you to believe that was a very specific rule, which it was not.
And and I'm sure she meant well by that, because pastorally, this is a great objective standard to adhere to strive for.
And I think if you don't know where to start, I think that's a great place to start. I mean, I think it's a beautiful standard to live by. But at the same time, I don't think, with today's clothing, you're necessarily going to find things that are always going to fit into that small standard. And so I just wanted people to know that if you're deviating outside of that, you're not committing some kind of sin or something.
Right. Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, look into it, do your own research, see what you find, and you can make a devotion out of it too, right? Like one of the pitfalls that you get is this fire and brimstone approach without any it's like, hey, it's okay to have been raised in circumstances where most people have no idea what they're doing. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's tough, but let's see what we can do about it, and let's figure out the intentionality that goes into, finding something that's objectively decent. And by the way, it's really courageous to even give it the time of day. A lot of people might not choose to do that, right? But for those of us who want to, let's go there. So let's do another quote. We heard from Benedict XV of holy memory, and now we've got Blessed Pius XI. Maidens and women dressed immodestly are to be debarred from Holy Communion and from acting as sponsors at the sacraments of baptism and confirmation. So one thing I think, by the way, like, I'm going to throw up here, I remember when we were in the Holy Land, I took a picture because I thought it was so cool, just about all the holy sites. We did 19 out of the 20 Rosary Mysteries when we were there, sites. And although the site of the Ascension is under Muslim territory currently, so for us, we counted that, like we were overlooking Jerusalem and we were like pointing to where it was. But anyways, just to be technical on that, but this sign was outside of just about all these sacred sites protected by the Franciscans, and I also saw the same kind of a sign when we were at the Vatican. You know, like, you couldn't go into St. Peter's if you didn't adhere to the modesty guidelines. And I think that is a good distinction for us to make here. Like, what a lot of, you know, the popes are saying is, and what's certainly true at all times, is when you're in the house of God, there's a standard that's even more exalted than whenever you're anywhere else, right? Like, I think that, you know, like, men should not be in shorts. Women probably shouldn't be in pants, right? Like, or there should be some sort of, you know, your form is protected, you know what I mean? But especially, you know, when you hear popes saying that are sainted nonetheless, that if you're dressed immodestly, you don't even belong coming up to the altar. That's an important thing for us to be hearing consistently from the pulpit, right?
Yeah, I think we really aren't hearing this. But I also think, you know, it also goes back to the whole belief in the Eucharist. There's so many people that don't believe that that is truly Jesus. And
right.
If you do truly believe that that's Jesus, why would you not? If you were to go visit the president or the king of some country, what would you wear? You would wear your finest clothing. Why would we not want to wear our finest clothing when we are receiving God?
Amen. And sometimes this is just on the matter of, you know, they say the way into heaven is through the mind of a child. Mm-hmm. This is like, if you just bring like a pious, or even sometimes you could say like a childlike simplicity to these subjects, it just makes things a lot simpler. Mm-hmm. Kind of like what you said before, like, if I'm just wearing certain clothing, I have so many things that just I am freed from having to worry about. Like, some people might just be like, okay, cool, I never heard this book existed, I'm going to check it out. All right, this pope said this is how I should wear my outfit. That's good enough for me. Boom, done. Episode's over. Have a nice life. You know what I mean? Like, but for the rest of us, and those of us who want to get all the intellectual whys or want to try to pour it over and whatever, it's like, okay, for the rest, we'll go there. And then for the 99% of the human population in general that just doesn't care, they're probably never going to find this anyway. So, but so now we've got another one. We got Pius XII, Venerable Pius XII. This was actually one of my favorite ones. He says, to say that modesty is a matter of custom is just as wrong as to say that honesty, that is truthfulness, is a matter of custom. That one I think is very powerful, and I think it lends a lot of strength to the importance of recognizing that there is a universal norm here, right? Because I think that this argument is one of the biggest arguments that modernists, or, you know, whatever, radical feminists, however you want to, people are going to identify themselves differently than we will necessarily, but that's the crux of what so many would say now. It's like, listen, get with the times, you know, like get with, you know, the genie's out of the bottle, the cat's out of the bag, Pandora's box is open, right? Like, women wear pants now, women are in the workplace ubiquitously, and there's certain outfits that just, this is the outfit you need to wear for the task, get over it. What do you want, women never to even ride bicycles? Like, you want to just keep them holed up in the kitchen? Like, I'm having fun with it at this point, but like, you get my point. Like, no, obviously I, for one, am not saying any of that, but we need to take seriously what Venerable Pius XII is saying here. Like, you can't just subjectivize the conversation, right? Do you have any thoughts about that? Like this appeal to customs. You know, modesty is just a matter of custom, just like honesty is just a matter of custom.
Well, I think our society, our customs are so, the bar is so low in general.
Right. So why would you even...
For the way we present ourselves and the way we interact with others,
right,
that why are we using that as our standard of dress?
Well put. I was going to get into this earlier, but we went somewhere else. I mentioned how my wife is involved on the social media with Colleen Hammond and the work she's done. You know, I'm not going to name names, but there are other super popular Catholic women. You know, I'm not going to say professional Catholics in this case, because I think some of these people, I actually look up to some of these people big time, but they sometimes get involved in a topic of conversation that's beyond their mission, like what it is that they're offering to Holy Mother Church. And a lot of times with women, like their own personal style choices or fashion choices enter into the public arena. Mm-hmm. And you see this from time to time, where these women who have provided great work to the life of the church and to the conversation about the culture, pro-life matters, whatever it might be, and then they go and they make these fashion choices that are just totally not in accordance with what the popes recommend. And you're like, what are we doing here? And my wife has noticed, Colleen Hammond has noticed that too. And it's like, so that's why it's important to have an ongoing conversation about this stuff. I think it's totally relevant. It's never not relevant to try to warn souls that, you know, listen, if you steer in the wrong direction when it comes to that sixth commandment, you're mortal sin territory, done. Like, you know, we got to define it. So anyways, what were you gonna?
Oh yes, this is the one. Okay, so it is often said with passive resignation that fashion reflects the customs of a people, but it would be more exact and more useful to say that they express the direction and moral direction that a nation intends to take, either to be shipwrecked in licentiousness or maintain itself at the level to which it has been raised by religion and civilization. So basically, our clothes are telling us we're headed in a really bad direction.
No! Why? Well, you know, a lot of saints have said that we are in an era now that's even worse than at the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is scary because our Lord, you know, warned us that next time the punishment will be by fire, not water, like the flooding, you know. And you know, that reminds me of a quote about Saint Jacinta, one of the Fatima children. You know, she said, quote, certain fashions will be introduced which will offend our Lord very much. Persons who serve God must not follow the fashions. The church does not have fashions. Our Lord is always the same. The sins of the world are very great. And that was back in the very early 1900s. You know, and of course, Saint Jacinta is one of the three Fatima children, and Our Lady of Fatima mentioned back then that souls are falling into hell like snowflakes as a result of the sins going on. And as you mentioned earlier, that was back then. Now, fashions have taken root that are very much all over the place. You know, we mentioned World War II, but to be fair, in the 1920s, you started to see, and I don't remember names, but there were certain, like, actresses, I think, that were starting to, you know, wear some wild at the time, different kinds of clothing. So that kind of started to take root. Then you had what happened with World War II. And then, of course, we all know by the 1960s with the sexual revolution, everything just kind of devolved from there. So it's important to contextualize. You know, you go back to Benedict XV, Pius XI. I mean, these were the popes of that time, the early 1900s. Just like the Fatima children, of course, Our Lady of Fatima, the most significant parts of that took place during 1917. And then, as the century went on, we entered into this territory that we've never been in before. I thought it was really weird to hear about the origin of bikinis. You know, like Bikini Atoll was the place where the atom bomb was created, and back then you couldn't pay an actress to wear that stuff. They considered it like pornography.
Yeah, they ended up having to get, they call women of the night, to dress in these scantily clad bathing suits. And now, if you look at the beach, that's what the majority of people are wearing.
Yeah. Yeah, there's certain entire cities that we can't even bring our kids to, because you just can't enjoy the beach environment without running into an objectively grave matter. Yeah, and it takes sacrifice and genuine intention to care about this stuff and to adhere, to conform to the values that ought to surround this important topic of modesty. which, by the way, I don't know if we ever touched on it. I know we talked offline, like the root of modesty.
The root of moderation is mode, which means to be like in the middle. So, to be modest, like I said, when I first converted back to the church, I was wearing turtlenecks and completely covering myself. And that's...
Did you ever try like burqas or...
No burqas.
No burqas? Okay, I was just, some people pull it off very well,
I don't think I could.
Okay, that's all right.
But God doesn't, we're created beautiful, and God wants us to be seen, but he also wants us to be clothed. Just like when Adam and Eve in the Bible, when they first realize that they're naked and they sew fig leaves into clothes, and God decides that's not enough, and then he takes more clothes and adds to what they have. It's not because he doesn't think we're beautiful, but there's a certain decorum in how we should be dressed and how we should look in front of others.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we fall short of that, one of the things that was really, really insightful for me is that there have been modern psychological studies, like this kind of is a nod to the Gestalt psychology, where researchers have studied, and they've come up with these laws, called the law of closure, and there's also the law of good continuation, which is this reality where men will continue to follow straight lines and complete them to their end. And also if there's if it's an incomplete image, we will complete it in our mind. And that's the issue when you're wearing form-fitting clothing, where the form is totally present. The researchers actually figured that out. They realized that if women are wearing pants that are perfectly tight, that the men's eyeballs always end up going to the intimate area of a woman, which is obviously inappropriate, but it's just literally it's because it's like ingrained into our psychology to do that. And unfortunately, the reason that the people did this research was so that they could target the human psychology and basically kind of like weaponize it, quite frankly, as far as I'm concerned, in the advertisement industry. And that's why with modern fashion, and my goodness, I can't even walk into some of our local malls, I've noticed, without worrying about running into a store where you've got see-through clothing on because they're trying to promote a bra or whatever the thing might be. And it's we've really fallen off the deep end on that. But it's important to realize we've even nowadays it seems like you have to do this immense case study in order to prove common sense. Mm-hmm. And that's just another objective scientific reality that you can point to say that's why the church has warned however long ago that you have to protect the form. So maybe we can shift what does that look like pragmatically, right? It doesn't just have to be dresses and just have to be skirts. It depends on what it is that you are accomplishing, right? We've already established, obviously, the most exalted norms apply when you're in God's house. But if you're out riding a bike with hubby, right? You can wear pants, but you can wear a longer shirt, right? Mm-hmm. Like a shirt that covers your form. That way you can do what's pragmatic, and you can also preserve modesty. That's why this isn't it shouldn't all be hyper-focused on skirts and dresses all the time, you know what I mean? And that's something that I would like to see become more a part of the conversation in the culture when it comes to this kind of a topic. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, again, there's a time and a place for what you're wearing and what's appropriate, and I think you need to be aware of that. And I think in our society we aren't. We just... you want to wear something and you wear it, and there's no thought behind what you're wearing. And I think that maybe having the knowledge that, this is how men's mind is built. And it's not that a man wants to scandalize a woman or look at her inappropriately, but that's just how his mind is. And so it's our job as women to be wearing clothing that will not bring a man to an occasion of sin.
And also, back to the point of embracing our differences, just about every communistic regime, I think every communistic regime that's taken over throughout history, one of the literal weapons that they wield is androgenizing the populace. Right? Like shifting to... I was actually just speaking with a theologian recently about this in preparation for this episode, and he pointed out how he actually said, make sure you mention this, that it's like for women wearing pants in general, like, okay, so it's not that pants themselves are absolutely evil at all times for women, right? Like, again, it's about the function of what you're accomplishing and preserving your form, right? But pragmatically speaking, if a woman's gonna shift to, like, again, wearing a longer shirt is boom, A-okay, that's good. But if you're gonna shift to, let's say, baggy pants instead, well, baggy pants throughout history, and again, this you shouldn't be appealing to local customs so much, according to the Venerable Pope. Baggy pants are what men wear. You know what I mean? So it's like you can try to work within the modern norms, but you're going to consistently kind of run into these road ends, these ends where you're like, well, yeah, but it might work functionally this way, but it might be kind of, not taking into account this aspect of it, the fact that we should be embracing our differences. So it kind of goes back full circle to say, let's be really careful in our cultural choices not to fall into that trap where men and women are demoralized because we're made to be so much like each other. I think that's such another important thing to just be aware of, that regimes that have a literal agenda to remove God from the conversation have views on fashion too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we always need to remember God made us male and female. I mean, we were meant to complement each other, and so we need to do that. That's, as Catholics, that's what we're called to do. We're not called to try to take over each other's jobs. We have very specific jobs, and they're beautiful jobs. And once you truly come to understand what your job is, if you love the Lord, you will find fulfillment in that. And there will be no need to try to take over the job of the other sex. I think we should also mention that modesty is not only about dress. Modesty is also about the way you speak and the way you act. And in our culture, our language is extremely vulgar, and we should attempt to rise above that and be speaking. I've heard it said that swearing means that you don't have a big enough vocabulary to express yourself in a different way. So let's take the time to speak differently than the rest of the culture.
Yeah, there's decorum and modesty in speech, as you had mentioned. Yeah, there are a lot of different aspects of modesty. It's not just about clothing. It's about the holistic person. It's about the totality of how we carry ourselves in the eyes of God, most importantly, and then of course others. And the goal and the purpose of living the virtue of charity is to carry ourselves with others for God's sake. So it all comes back to Him, right? And I've got one here for you. Let me throw this at you and just get your initial reaction. So we haven't touched on Cardinal Siri, who's a very fascinating figure in the life of Holy Mother Church. So Cardinal Siri was around in the middle 20th century when he weighed on this topic. So right around, with the 1960s and the revolution going on there. And one thing that he has mentioned, he wrote a famous treatise on this topic, like specifically warning against women wearing pants. Like he was really big on like women shouldn't do that. And one thing that he mentioned is that pants on a woman are more dangerous than a woman in a miniskirt. What's your initial reaction to that?
That's really interesting.
Do you want to know why he says that?
Yeah, I'm curious.
Okay. So his thought process is because, at least a man knows that his lower faculties are being attacked if someone's wearing a miniskirt, whereas it's much more subtle what pants, of course we're talking about form-fitting, because that's usually what women are wearing if they're wearing pants, right? It's just much more subtle because, again, it goes back to that, like, the law of closure and everything and where the eyes are drawn. And so it was like the proverbial frog being boiled in the pot kind of a thing, the way that some of this stuff seeped into the culture, which of course we know is a lot of times the way that the enemy works, right? He gets the foothold in gradually. So he was a very it's just another a fact in history to check it out. If this is a topic that's of interest for you, check out Cardinal Siri, Siri, and see what he had to say on it. You kind of have to have like a philosophical refinement to understand how pants would be worse than a miniskirt in his eyes. And it's because of the relationship of the intellect versus the lower bodily faculties. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating character. Some thought that he was supposed to be the next pope after Venerable Pius XII. Did you ever hear about that? Mm-mm. So this is a total aside, but it's fascinating, so I'll share it anyways. There's 3 things that have to happen for a pope to be elected. The cardinals have to all come into agreement on who it'll be. Mm-hmm. That person has to accept it, and then he has to pick his name. Then they bellow the white smoke. Okay. They don't light that fire until those 3 things have happened, right? So in 1958, when Venerable Pius XII had passed, apparently Cardinal Siri was elected the Pope, and he picked a name, Gregory the 17th, and then the smoke started bellowing. Because, again, those things had to happen before the smoke was even there. And the Vatican radio reported on the smoke. And then all of a sudden, something happened, and he never ended up becoming the next pope.
Interesting.
And then I think 2 days later, it was John the 23rd who became the pope, and then he would go on to open Vatican II, and then Paul VI would close it after him, and then we had John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and so on. And so... yeah, I think, and I guess one reason why I bring that up is because for those who genuinely yearn for a return to tradition and a return to just a more pious and chaste society, as do I, when you hear about a lot of these different weird things that happen in life of the church, like what I just explained to you could sound really conspiratorial really quickly. Mm-hmm. It's not. I mean, there's a whole FBI dossier on this and everything. Like, it happened. And, I don't know why or what really went on behind closed doors. And it's not, we're in a different chapter of history at this point. But a lot of people sometimes that do care about this stuff pick up on those things. And they're like, wait a minute, the guy that was trying to defend the true Catholic teaching on modesty got sidelined. What happened there? Like, people they come up with all kinds of interesting ideas as a result of this stuff. But the fact remains, there's this really rich history about what the church has said on this subject of modesty. And there's just so much to reflect on. And I think it's important to be intentional about all aspects of virtue.
I think just in general, as you journey in your Catholic faith and you start to grow in virtue, that as you grow in your love of God and your love of virtue, that you'll see that God will change things in your life that you never expected to change. I never in a million years thought I'd be a person who was wearing skirts. In fact, I used to think people who wore only skirts were kind of crazy. So
Really?
here I am. I used to think I wanted to be the breadwinner in my marriage. And, so many aspects of my life are so different than I ever imagined they would be.
Right. Which, by the way, I wanted to ask you, did you ever carry someone out of a burning building?
I did not, no.
No? That would have been so awesome. Did you ever go into a burning building?
I did.
Really?
Yes.
That is super cool.
Yeah.
What was your mission? Did you have the fire hose, or what were you doing?
With the hose. I mean, I was the second person with the hose, so I wasn't in front. But yeah, I think, like I said, that the 2 weeks of boot camp made it very obvious that I was not going to be the hero in a fire or anything.
Right. Wow. Did you stick with it for a while, though, or?
Yeah. I was in it for a couple of years, yeah.
That's really cool. I appreciate you doing that. But I think what you just said, maybe we should close with this because, okay, we've kind of laid out, a lot of the points that Colleen Hammond brought to the fore. We've laid out how there's a pastoral way to introduce this subject that can be more or less helpful. I certainly think that it's an important thing for Catholics to be exposed to. I mean, again, I've spoken with so many men and women, and across the board, a lot of people have never even thought of this before. That's why we kind of joked in the beginning, it's like an unwinnable debate that nobody even knows that they should care about in the first place. So why even do it? And it's it deserves a space. I think that Colleen Hammond, by and large, did a great job of bringing, a lot of these different data pieces together to draw, to paint the constellation of what's happened throughout the 20th century. That's a very important contribution to the subject. I think that if somebody reads it and they don't have the theological training, they might read some of these papal quotes or saint quotes and think that they have a level of bindingness that they don't. So hopefully this conversation has helped to at least introduce that reality and, just, do your due diligence there. But then also, it's an ongoing discernment for everybody on the subjective level. But objectively, let's preserve our form.
I also want to say, if you are having a visceral reaction to this conversation that you're hearing, I encourage you to take time to reflect why that is. Is it really because what we're saying is so awful that women would have to wear skirts? And again, I'm not saying women have to wear skirts, but if it's really bothering you, maybe take that to prayer and ask God why that is. Because maybe it's bothering you because in your heart, it's kind of the right direction to go.
It could be. And I think what I love about your contribution to our conversation today, Liz, is when I'm throwing these papal quotes at you or this or that factoid, you're just listen, at the end of the day, it's keep it simple, and so I'm thankful to hear your perspective because, men aren't supposed to talk about this. And but seriously though, I think you as a woman, no one's going to understand like a woman, obviously. And I don't make light of that. I can't fully appreciate the struggle, so to speak, like a woman can. And, you've been on that journey. So I don't know if I think the advice you just gave was spot on. It's at the end of the day, soul search. Don't do anything for the other necessarily. I mean, you should do everything because of love of God. But let's say even if somebody's not religious, just as a thought experiment, and remove that, just for yourself, be true to yourself. Ask yourself why you would not even want to consider something like this if you're struggling with it.
I will also say on my faith journey, every time I get to something new that God is asking me to do, it's always hard. It's never easy. And it takes some time to pray through that and work through that. And finally, by the grace of God, I accept it. But then the next thing he asked me is just as hard. So nothing about being Catholic is easy. Nothing about living Catholicism out in our society is easy. And everything God is going to ask you to do is hard. And nowhere in the Bible does he ever say it's going to be easy. In fact, he tells you that you will suffer. And so what you should expect in your life is suffering and nothing more.
Wow. That's deep spiritually. Take up your cross daily and follow me.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, and this is just like, this is like kind of the beginning of the spiritual journey too, right? Mm-hmm. Like putting on the right clothes in the morning to take on the entire rest of your day and the rest of your life, right? Like is kind of like, that's why sometimes it's like, it's not even a good hill to die on, right? Like getting into all of this stuff. You know, I would propose, kind of like how people say don't ever talk religion and politics. Actually, it's the opposite is true. The great philosophers of all time and age have said if you can't talk religion or politics, then you have very little to offer to society. And so too, this conversation needs to happen, but it's just like, let's get the pragmatic, things that we should do about it. Rest easy in that. And shift to peace. You mentioned that you have such peace with your husband, right? Like, St. Augustine says peace is the tranquility of order. Once you just, submit to God's design and whatever that hierarchy looks like, and, figure out what this topic of modesty means for you, employ it, and then move on. There's a whole adventure awaiting for you.
Right. And really, if you aren't at peace about a decision, then you need to take that back to prayer. Because there should be peace when you are aligned with God's plan for your life. Right.
Yeah, and if there was ever an opportunity for that, father and his daughters who were teenagers at the time, they're probably in college now, to hear something like this, that would be a blessing. Because, I think that when done tactfully, this is kind of up there with some of those very important soul-searching conversations that God would like all of us to wrestle with, if it has to be a wrestling match at all. So, yeah, any maybe parting words of wisdom as we close our reflection on this?
As with all things, think about this conversation, bring it to prayer, and you don't have to make a decision today. God will work on your heart, and if there's something that he wishes to change in you, then he will over time through prayer. Just know that at the end of the day, this is not our home, and this is not where we will be for eternity. This is a blip in eternity. And so our striving is for heaven. And so what society says is the norm should not be our guidelines, and what ultimately the only person we should care about their opinion is God.
Right. And my parting words of wisdom would be, women should have the right to be women, and men should have the right to be men. And we need to be able to have conversations like this responsibly. There needs to be a safe space, so to speak, for this, just like anything else, because it's so important. It's such a critical piece of healthy culture. And also, just as a trained theologian, when I went on this journey myself, I looked up all the major Catholic sources of information that I could on this subject. The saints, I think it's St. Thomas Aquinas, probably, but someone said, fear the man of one book, beware the person of one book, right? Like, Dressing with Dignity was a tremendous launch pad into this conversation, and I thank Colleen Hammond for her contributions big time, and more importantly for the courage to do that. But that was just the beginning of an important journey for me. I tried to look up articles on Catholic answers, of which I have tremendous respect. I've learned so much about apologetics over my young adult years when that was available. on this subject, they when you log into the main webpage, at least in years past, I can't speak for today, but they would have like an imprimatur and a nihil obstat on there, basically saying everything that we say is free of moral error. That's a very high bar. Like, it's one thing to have one book, static book, and to have that, but to have that on a dynamic website that's constantly being updated, it's just fascinating, because when I dove into this topic with them, they had almost nothing on it, and what they did have on it was very much at odds with what popes have said on the subject. And that was jarring for me. Sometimes you get people that write these one-off articles, and I don't even, they might have been with the company for a year or less. But either way, for somebody in that snapshot of time that's looking for genuine answers on this, there's a lot of misinformation, and it can be really confusing to navigate. So my parting word of wisdom in light of all of that, and that's, and I have a great love for Catholic Answers. I've brought famous speakers to our diocese for the youth with them earlier this year. So I have nothing but great things to say there. And they're just one of many examples that, don't be that person of one book. Don't just fall into the trap that, well, my favorite, Catholic apostolate that itches my soft spot said this, so I can just go back to sleep on the topic. It's like, that's not authentic. The true philosopher's quest is to follow the truth where it leads you, regardless of the personal cost. And the fact of the matter is that the popes have weighed in on this, the saints have said things about this, and when we distill it to what's universal and still binding today, it's the fact that, we have to protect the sacredness of our form, which is good and beautiful and a blessing, and that God gave us to share with our spouses, in holy matrimony, right? So it's just, there's so much good to be had out of thinking about it from a positive, instead of thinking about it as, what you can't do. You know what I mean? Does that resonate? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we do tend to focus on what we can't do, and really it's all about, how we can present ourselves in a beautiful way that clothes ourselves in dignity for ourselves and everyone around us.
Amen. Well, Liz, Anna, thank you so much for joining the episode today, and thank you to your husband, who you asked to be on, and I hope that everybody, gains something of value on it. So is there anything that we can maybe pray for you about in the days ahead? Or
I think just my journey through motherhood, because 3 kids is, quite, I know 3 is not a lot compared to some people, but
oh yeah,
at the moment when they're all little, it's overwhelming some days.
I totally know what you mean. Well, praise God, you heard that. We've got the prayer request registered, so thank you so much again for sharing of your wisdom and your experience today.
It's been a fun time.
Awesome. And if you enjoy content like this, please make sure to subscribe to The Apostolate. It's so necessary in order for us to get wholesome Catholic content like this that many people don't take the time to wrestle with and to deeply research out there. And also, if you want to check out another perspective from a woman of faith about, the challenges of relations between men and women, check out this conversation with Christine Webb. And of course, we've got all these different episodes of The Rich Dawn. Thank you so much, and God bless you.